The thunder of distant hooves echoed across the dusty plains as Virginia Lawson clutched her trembling hands to her chest, watching helplessly as her wagon's wheels sank deeper into the muddy embankment. The unforgiving Montana sun beat down mercilessly, and with each passing moment, her hope dwindled like the last drops in her nearly empty canteen. It was 1876, and the promise of a new life in Helena seemed further away than the stars themselves. Virginia had left behind everything in Boston following her father's death and the subsequent revelation of his mountainous debts. At 22, she found herself alone, penniless, and now stranded on the outskirts of civilization with a broken wagon and dwindling supplies. Pride had been her constant companion. Since childhood her father had raised her that way, and even now, as desperation clawed at her, she couldn't bring herself to flag down the occasional rider who passed in the distance. "Come on," she muttered, pushing her shoulder against the wagon's side for the umpteenth time, her once fine blue dress now caked with mud and sweat. The wheel merely groaned in response, sinking further into the muck. Virginia bit her lip to keep from crying. Ladies didn't cry in public, another of her father's lessons that seemed particularly useless out here in the wild. She didn't notice the approaching rider until his shadow fell across her. Startled, Virginia straightened, frantically trying to brush the dirt from her skirts while maintaining whatever dignity she had left. "Looks like you could use a hand, madam," the man said, his voice deep and gentle as the Montana breeze. Virginia looked up, squinting against the sun that silhouetted him. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders squared beneath a worn leather vest, a dusty Stetson pulled low over his eyes. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she replied stiffly, even as her wagon creaked and settled deeper into the mud. The cowboy dismounted with easy grace, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. He pushed his hat back, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, yet handsome in its rugged way. His eyes were a startling green against his tanned skin, crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Name's Grant Ryder," he said, extending a calloused hand. "And unless you're planning to homestead right here in this mud pit, I reckon you do need help, whether you're willing to ask for it or not." Virginia hesitated, her Boston propriety warring with practical necessity. Another ominous creak from the wagon made the decision for her. "Virginia Lawson," she replied, briefly touching his outstretched hand before quickly withdrawing her own. "And perhaps I could use some assistance, just to get the wheel unstuck." Grant's smile widened. "That's a start." He assessed the situation with a practiced eye. "Where you headed, Miss Lawson?" "Helena," she answered, lifting her chin. "I have prospects there." Something in his expression told her he saw through the lie, but he merely nodded. "Helena's still a fair piece away. You planning to make that journey alone?" Virginia stiffened. "I am perfectly capable, never said you weren't," Grant interrupted, raising his hands in surrender. "Just making conversation while I figure out how to get your wagon free without breaking the axle." For the next hour, Grant worked methodically, digging around the wheel, placing boards for traction, and finally using his horse to pull the wagon free. Virginia tried to help, but her city-bred hands were already blistered and sore from her earlier attempts. "There," Grant said finally, as the wagon rolled onto firmer ground. He wiped his brow with his sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. "That should hold you, but that wheel's going to need proper fixing before you go much further." Virginia's heart sank. "Another expense she couldn't afford. I'm sure I can manage." Grant studied her for a long moment. "There's a town about 5 miles west of here. Pinewood Creek. Small place, but they've got a decent blacksmith. I'm headed that way myself if you'd care for an escort." Pride urged her to refuse, to thank him politely and continue on her way. But the setting sun and the prospect of another night alone on the trail made her hesitate. "I wouldn't want to impose," she said finally. "No imposition," he replied, already moving to check her horse's harness. "Been riding alone too long anyway. Wouldn't mind the company." As they set off toward Pinewood Creek, Virginia couldn't help glancing at the tall cowboy riding alongside her wagon. There was something reassuring about his presence, something that made the vast, intimidating landscape seem less threatening. "You're not from around here," Grant observed after they'd traveled in silence for a while. Virginia gripped the reins tighter. "Is it that obvious?" His laugh was warm and genuine. "Let's just say most women heading to Montana don't wear fine Boston boots, even if they are covered in mud now." She felt her cheeks flush. "I didn't exactly plan this journey with practical considerations in mind." "Most journeys worth taking aren't planned," he replied thoughtfully. "It's the unexpected trails that usually lead somewhere interesting." Virginia wasn't sure how to respond to that. For as long as she could remember, her life had been one of careful planning and propriety. Even this desperate venture west had been calculated a last-ditch effort to claim a distant relative's property in Helena before creditors could track her down. The property might not be much, but it was all she had left. "And what about you, Mr. Ryder? What brings you to this part of the territory?" Grant adjusted his hat. "Just passing through. I've got a small spread north of here, but I do some work for the stage company from time to time, escorting shipments, scouting routes." "You're a gunman?" Virginia asked, unable to keep the note of alarm from her voice. He chuckled. "Rancher first. The gun's just a tool out here, like a plow or a hammer, sometimes necessary but not what defines a man." As they approached Pinewood Creek, Virginia found herself oddly reluctant for their journey to end. Grant Ryder was unlike any man she'd met in Boston, straightforward, without pretense, and with a quiet confidence that came from competence rather than social standing. The town itself was little more than a wide spot in the trail: a general store, a small hotel, a saloon, and a blacksmith shop clustered around a dusty main street. Several cabins dotted the hillside beyond, smoke curling from their chimneys in the fading light. "We'll get your wagon looked at first thing in the morning," Grant said as they pulled up in front of the hotel. "For now, let's get you settled for the night." Virginia's stomach clenched as she thought about her dwindling funds. "I should perhaps inquire about the cost. Old Tom Bailey runs this place," Grant interrupted. "Decent rooms at fair prices. You'll be safe here." He must have read the concern on her face because he added, "The livery stable has a hayloft where I've bunked before. Don't worry about me." But it wasn't him she was worried about. Virginia had exactly $3.42 to her name, not enough to fix a wagon wheel and pay for a hotel room, let alone continue her journey to Helena. The hotel owner, a gruff older man with a surprisingly gentle manner, showed her to a small but clean room. Grant carried her single trunk up the narrow stairs despite her protests. "Get some rest," he said, placing the trunk at the foot of the bed. "Things often look clearer after a night's sleep." Left alone, Virginia sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back all day to fall. What had she been thinking, traveling across the country with barely enough money to last a week? How was she going to reach Helena? And even if she did, what then? The property might be nothing more than a shack, if it existed at all. Morning came too soon, sunlight filtering through the thin curtains. Virginia dressed quickly in her cleanest remaining dress, a practical gray cotton that had seen better days. She'd have to find work soon, but what skills did a Boston socialite's daughter have that would be valued in Montana territory? Grant was waiting downstairs, talking with the blacksmith, a burly man with arms like tree trunks. Both men turned as she descended the stairs. "Morning, Miss Lawson," Grant said, tipping his hat. "This is Hank Weaver, best smithy between Billings and Helena." "Madam," the blacksmith nodded, "Mr. Ryder here was just telling me about your wagon trouble." "I've had a look at it," Grant explained. "The wheel's not just stuck, the rim's cracked and 2 spokes are broken. Hank says he can fix it, but it'll take a day or 2. Virginia felt the blood drain from her face. "I see, and the cost?" The men exchanged glances. $4 should cover materials and labor," Hank said finally. "It might as well have been 400, Virginia swallowed hard. "I see," she repeated, her mind racing. "Perhaps there's work I could do in town while I wait, to earn the money for repairs." Grant's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the blacksmith beat him to it. Matter of fact, my wife's laid up with a bad back. Could use some help with the young'uns and keeping house for a couple days. Wouldn't be fancy work, but it'd cover your repair costs." Relief washed over Virginia like a cool breeze. "I would be most grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Weaver." The blacksmith nodded, seemingly satisfied. "She'll be expecting you then, little house behind the shop." As Hank lumbered off, Virginia turned to Grant. "Thank you," she said softly. "I suspect you had something to do with that offer." Grant shrugged, but his eyes twinkled. "Hank's wife has been laid up for about 3 years now, far as I know, but they do have 4 kids who could probably use some civilizing influence." "Still," Virginia insisted, "you didn't have to help me. We all need a hand sometimes, Miss Lawson. No shame in that." He hesitated, then added, "I've got some business in town, but I'll check in on you later if that's all right." Virginia nodded, oddly comforted by the thought. As she watched him stride down the dusty street, she wondered about the circumstances that had brought this kind stranger into her path just when she needed help most. The Weaver's home was small but tidy, with a woman who didn't look remotely ill directing operations from a rocking chair on the porch. The 4 children ranged from a toddling girl of about 3 to a lanky boy of 12 who eyed Virginia with undisguised suspicion. "So you're the Boston lady," Mrs. Weaver said by way of greeting. "Hope you're not afraid of hard work. I can learn whatever needs doing," Virginia replied, lifting her chin, and learned she did. By midday, her back ached from sweeping, washing, and chasing after the youngest Weaver child. Her hands were red and raw from scrubbing laundry, and she'd discovered muscles she never knew existed. But there was also a strange satisfaction in the work, immediate results she could see and touch, so different from the endless rounds of social calls and embroidery that had filled her days in Boston. "You ain't half bad for a city girl, Mrs." Weaver conceded as they sat down to a simple lunch of bread and stew. "Though you look about ready to fall over," Virginia managed a tired smile, "I'll improve with practice. You planning to stay in Pinewood Creek then?" "No, I'm bound for Helena as soon as my wagon is repaired, Mrs." Weaver nodded sagely. "Husband, family, neither," Virginia admitted. "I'm starting fresh." Something in the older woman's expression softened. "Ain't easy for a woman alone out here, but you've got grit, I'll give you that." The afternoon brought more chores, but also stories from Mrs. Weaver about life in the territory, tales of harsh winters, summer dances, neighborly feuds, and the slow building of a community in this wild place. Virginia found herself laughing more than she had in months. As the sun began to set, there was a knock at the door. The oldest Weaver boy opened it to reveal Grant, hat in hand. "Evening," he said, nodding to Mrs. Weaver. "Thought I might walk Miss Lawson back to the hotel. Streets can get rowdy when the ranch hands come in." Mrs. Weaver gave him a knowing look. "Been wondering when you'd show up, Ryder." "Girls earned her keep and then some. You see she gets a proper meal tonight." Virginia hurriedly gathered her things, oddly flustered by Grant's presence. She'd spent the day with dirt smudged on her face and her hair falling from its pins, hardly the picture of composure she'd been raised to maintain. "You don't have to escort me," she said as they stepped outside. "It's only a short walk." "I know," he replied simply. "But I'd like to if you'll allow it." The main street was indeed becoming lively, with men gathering at the saloon and the sound of a piano drifting into the evening air. Virginia was acutely aware of the glances cast their way as they passed. "How was your day with the Weavers?" Grant asked. "Educational," Virginia replied with a small smile. "Mrs. Weaver is remarkably spry for someone supposedly bedridden." Grant laughed. "She's a force of nature, that's for certain. Her bark's worse than her bite, though." "I like her," Virginia admitted. "She doesn't pretend to be something she's not." They reached the hotel, but instead of saying goodnight, Grant held the door open. "Join me for supper. The hotel dining room isn't fancy, but Tom's wife makes a mean venison stew." Virginia hesitated, her instinct to refuse battling with both hunger and a surprising desire for his company. "I shouldn't impose, it's just a meal, Miss Lawson," he said gently. "No obligations." Something in his tone, the lack of pressure, the simple offer of companionship decided her. "Then yes, thank you." I would like that very much. The dining room was small, just 4 tables covered in checkered cloth. A plump woman who introduced herself as Mary Bailey served them generous bowls of stew and plates of fresh bread with a flourish. "You're looking peaky, girl," she declared, eyeing Virginia critically. "Need some meat on those bones if you're going to survive out here." Virginia flushed, but Grant just chuckled. "Mary mothers everyone who passes through," he explained after she'd bustled away, "been doing it for 20 years. "How do you know these people so well?" Virginia asked, taking a cautious bite of the rich stew. It was delicious, and she realized just how hungry she was. "I've been riding these trails for most of my life," Grant said. "Pinewood Creek's a regular stop, good people here mostly." "And where is home for you? You mentioned a ranch." Something flickered across his face, a brief shadow quickly hidden. "Small, spread about 40 miles north. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. Paid for it with 5 years of driving cattle and doing odd jobs. Finally got clear title last year." There was pride in his voice, and Virginia found herself envying his clear sense of purpose and place in the world. "That's quite an accomplishment," she said sincerely. Grant shrugged. "It's a start. Range is good, water's reliable, looking to expand when I can." He paused, then asked, "What about you? What's waiting in Helena?" Virginia stared into her bowl, debating how much to reveal. "My father died 6 months ago," she said finally. "He was not as financially sound as everyone believed. When the creditors finished, there was nothing left." She swallowed hard. "I have a great-uncle who passed away in Helena some years ago. He left a small property that my father never bothered to claim. It's my hope that it's still there and that I can make something of it." "I'm sorry about your father," Grant said quietly. "Thank you, we weren't close in his final years, but he was all the family I had." Grant seemed to consider her words carefully. "Do you know anything about this property? Location, condition?" Virginia shook her head. "Only an address from an old letter. I'm not even certain it still exists. Helena's growing fast. Lot of new construction since they struck gold in Last Chance Gulch." He hesitated. "It's also expensive. Living costs are high with all the mining activity." The implications of his words settled heavily on Virginia's shoulders. She'd known, of course, that her plan was tenuous at best, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly, frighteningly real. "I'll manage," she said, more sharply than she'd intended. Grant didn't press the issue, instead steering the conversation to lighter topics, stories of cattle drives and frontier characters, the changing seasons in Montana, the year he'd spent panning for gold before deciding that steady ranching suited him better. Virginia found herself laughing at his tales and sharing a few of her own about Boston society and its absurdities. As they finished their meal, Virginia realized she'd enjoyed herself more than she had in years. There was something refreshingly direct about Grant Ryder, a lack of pretense that made conversation easy and genuine. "Thank you for supper," she said as they rose to leave, "and for everything else. Your kindness to a stranger is remarkable." "Not such a stranger anymore, I think," Grant replied with a smile that warmed his green eyes. "Besides, out here, helping each other isn't kindness, it's survival." That night, lying in her narrow hotel bed, Virginia found her thoughts returning to Grant. In Boston, he wouldn't have merited a second glance from her social circle, his clothes too rough, his manner too direct, his hands too work-worn. Yet here, in this vast territory where artifice counted for nothing, she found herself drawn to those very qualities. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Virginia returned to the Weavers' home, where she spent the day cooking, cleaning, and minding the children. Mrs. Weaver proved to be a font of practical knowledge, teaching Virginia how to make soap from lye and fat, how to identify edible plants that grew wild in the area, and 100 other skills that had never been part of a Boston lady's education. "You're a quick study, Mrs. Weaver commented as Virginia successfully kneaded dough for the evening's bread. "Most city folks take one look at what needs doing out here and hightail it back east. I don't have that luxury," Virginia admitted, "and I find I'm enjoying learning useful skills," Mrs. Weaver snorted. "Useful," she says. "Girl, these ain't just useful, they're what keeps you alive when winter comes or crops fail." That evening, as Virginia was preparing to leave, Hank Weaver appeared at the door. "Wheels fixed," he announced. "Reinforced the rim and replaced 3 spokes instead of 2. Should hold up better now." Relief flooded through Virginia. "Thank you, Mr. Weaver. I can't tell you how grateful I am." He waved away her thanks. "Wife says you've more than worked it off, says you're welcome back anytime if Helena doesn't pan out." It was a generous offer, and one that Virginia tucked away as a possible lifeline. "I'll remember that." As she walked back to the hotel, Virginia spotted Grant emerging from the telegraph office, his expression troubled. He brightened when he saw her, quickening his pace to join her. "Wagon's fixed," she told him, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "I can leave for Helena tomorrow." Something crossed his face: disappointment, concern. It was gone too quickly to identify. "That's good news," he said, "but there's something we should discuss." "Would you walk with me a bit?" Curious and slightly alarmed, Virginia fell into step beside him as he led her toward the edge of town, where a small creek bubbled alongside a grove of cottonwood trees. The setting sun cast everything in golden light, and in other circumstances it might have been a romantic setting. "What is it?" she asked when they reached the creek bank. Grant removed his hat, running a hand through his son's streaked brown hair. "I received some news from Helena today," he said carefully. "There was a fire in the older section of town 3 weeks ago. Several buildings were destroyed." Virginia felt her heart sink. "And you think?" "I can't be certain," he said quickly. "But the area mentioned matches the address you described to me. I sent a telegram to a friend there to inquire further." Virginia sank onto a fallen log, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I see." Grant sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "It might not be your property," he offered. "And even if it was, there could be insurance, or perhaps the land itself still has value." But they both knew these were hollow reassurances. Virginia had staked everything on this desperate gamble, and now even that slim hope was crumbling. "What will I do?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Grant was quiet for a long moment. "You have options," he said finally. "More than you might think." Virginia gave a humorless laugh. "Do I? With no money, no family, no prospects, you have skills," he countered. "Maybe not the ones valued in Boston drawing rooms, but Mrs. Weaver says you're smart and hardworking. Those count for more out here than fancy manners or family connections. Are you suggesting I stay in Pinewood Creek, work as a housekeeper?" There was no disdain in her voice, only genuine uncertainty. "It would be a start," Grant said. Or, he hesitated, seeming to wrestle with himself. "My ranch needs attention. It's been just me, and I'm gone too often. The house is small but solid. There's a garden plot gone to weeds and rooms that haven't seen a woman's touch in years." Virginia stared at him, not comprehending at first. "What are you suggesting?" Grant met her gaze directly. "I'm not proposing marriage, if that's what you're thinking. Not yet, anyway. We hardly know each other." A faint smile touched his lips. "But I am offering you a place to stay while you figure things out, a room of your own, meals and wages for helping with the house and garden." "You would employ me as what? A housekeeper, as a partner," he corrected. "Someone with a stake in making the place better. The wages would be yours to save or spend as you choose. If Helena doesn't work out, or even if it does but doesn't offer what you need, you'd have somewhere to come back to. Time to plan your next move." Virginia looked away, watching the creek water catch the last rays of sunlight. It was an extraordinary offer from a man she'd known less than 3 days. In Boston, such an arrangement would be scandalous, a young, unmarried woman living under the same roof as a bachelor. But this wasn't Boston, and conventional rules seemed as distant as the city itself. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. Grant took his time answering. "I've been alone a long while," he said at last. "Built something I'm proud of, but there's no joy in it without someone to share it with. I'm not asking for anything improper, Virginia. Just a chance to see if what I feel starting between us might grow into something more, given time." Virginia's breath caught at his use of her given name, spoken with such gentle regard. "And if it doesn't, if we find we don't suit?" "Then you'll have had time to save some money and make better plans. No obligations, no expectations." His green eyes held her steadily. I won't lie to you, I'm hoping for more, but I won't demand it. It was madness, completely against everything she'd been raised to believe proper and right. And yet, there was something undeniably appealing about his straightforward offer. No pretense, no games, just the simple truth of a man who saw something in her worth valuing. I should go to Helena first, she said slowly, see for myself what remains of my great-uncle's property. I owe myself that much, Grant nodded, unsurprised. Of course, that makes good sense. But, Virginia continued, hardly believing her own words, if things are as you suspect, I would be grateful for your offer, though I insist it be a proper business arrangement with clear terms. Relief and something warmer flooded his expression. Agreed, we can draw up terms that satisfy your concerns. He hesitated, then added, I meant to journey to Helena myself soon. There's a horse auction I've been planning to attend. If you're amenable, we could travel together. The practical advantages were obvious: safety in numbers, shared resources, his knowledge of the territory. But Virginia also found herself simply wanting his company on the long journey ahead. That would be sensible, she agreed, trying to sound businesslike despite the flutter in her chest. Grant smiled, replacing his hat. Then it's settled. We'll leave day after tomorrow if that suits you, give you another day to rest and prepare. As they walked back toward town in the gathering twilight, Virginia felt a strange mix of emotions: anxiety about what awaited in Helena, uncertainty about the unorthodox arrangement she'd just agreed to, but also a tremulous hope that had been absent for so long she'd almost forgotten its feeling. That night, as she prepared for bed, Virginia caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. Her face was touched with color from days in the sun, and there was a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd left Boston. Perhaps this wild territory was changing her already, stripping away layers of artificial constraint to reveal the woman beneath. The next day passed in a flurry of preparations. Virginia purchased a few practical items from the general store: a sturdy hat to protect against the sun, a pair of gloves, some basic provisions for the journey. The storekeeper's wife, upon learning she was traveling to Helena, insisted on showing her a catalog of the latest fashions available for order from back east. Helena's quite cosmopolitan now, the woman explained, her eyes bright with vicarious excitement. They have opera performances and literary societies. Nothing like Boston, of course, but civilized, not like here. She glanced around the modest store with a sigh. Virginia thanked her politely, but found herself unexpectedly defensive of Pinewood Creek and its inhabitants. They might lack certain refinements, but there was an authenticity to their lives that she was beginning to value more than the sophisticated veneer of her former world. That evening, Grant joined her for supper again, this time bringing maps that they spread across the table after their meal. It's about 100 miles to Helena, he explained, tracing the route with his finger. Good weather and no troubles, we can make it in 4 days, 5 if we take it easy. Virginia studied the map, noting the vast empty spaces between the few marked settlements. It seems so remote. It is, Grant agreed, but that's changing fast. Railroads pushing through, more settlers coming every month. In 10 years, this territory will be unrecognizable. There was a note in his voice that made her look up. Does that trouble you? He considered the question seriously. Change isn't all bad. Brings doctors, schools, more opportunity for folks, but there's something about this land when it's empty, something that speaks to the soul. I'd hate to see that lost entirely. His eloquence surprised her, revealing depth she hadn't fully appreciated. You love it here, she observed. I do. His gaze met hers across the table. Took me a while to understand why. Back east, a man's worth is measured by what he owns or who his family is. Out here, you're judged by what you can do, how you handle yourself when things get rough. There's a freedom in that I never found anywhere else. Virginia thought about her life in Boston, the endless social calculations, the importance of appearances, the crushing weight of others' expectations. I think I understand, she said softly. They planned their departure for dawn. Grant would bring extra supplies from his own provisions, and they would take turns driving the wagon while he rode alongside on his horse. The journey would be challenging, but for the first time since leaving Boston, Virginia felt a spark of genuine anticipation rather than dread. As they said goodnight outside her hotel room door, Grant hesitated. "Whatever we find in Helena," he said, "I want you to know I admire your courage, Virginia. Not many would have the strength to start over the way you're doing." The simple compliment, spoken with such sincerity, touched her more deeply than any flowery praise she'd ever received. "Thank you," she whispered. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Virginia felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Then Grant tipped his hat and was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. Morning arrived with a palette of reds and golds streaking the eastern sky. Virginia dressed with care in her practical gray dress, her hair neatly braided and pinned. Her few possessions were packed, and she settled her account with Tom Bailey, who wished her well with gruff kindness. Grant was waiting outside with the wagon, already loaded and ready for travel. His horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, stood patiently alongside. He helped Virginia up to the driver's seat with a steady hand. "Ready for adventure, Miss Lawson?" he asked, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "As ready as I'll ever be, Mr. Ryder," she replied, returning his smile despite the butterflies in her stomach. They set off as the sun cleared the horizon, the town of Pinewood Creek soon dwindling behind them. The trail wound through rolling hills covered with grass that rippled like water in the morning breeze. Wildflowers dotted the landscape with splashes of purple and yellow, and in the distance, the jagged silhouette of mountains cut against the sky. Grant rode sometimes ahead, sometimes alongside the wagon, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the territory. Virginia found herself relaxing into the rhythm of travel, the steady plod of the horses and the creak of wagon wheels becoming a familiar soundtrack to their days. They camped the first night near a small creek shaded by cottonwoods. Grant efficiently set up their camp, building a small fire and preparing a simple but satisfying meal of beans, bacon, and coffee. Virginia insisted on helping, though her city-bred hands were clumsy with the unfamiliar tasks. "You'll get the hang of it," Grant assured her as he showed her how to bank the fire properly for the night. "Took me months to learn all this when I first came west." "Where did you come from originally?" Virginia asked, realizing she knew little about his past. Grant settled back against his saddle, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Ohio, farm country. Father had a decent spread, but 5 sons, not enough land to go around." A shadow crossed his face. "After the war, things were difficult. Came west in '68 looking for something different." "You fought in the war?" Virginia asked gently. He nodded, his expression distant. "Union cavalry, saw things no man should have to see." He fell silent for a moment, then visibly shook off the memories. "What about you? Always lived in Boston?" Virginia welcomed the change of subject. "Yes, until now. My mother died when I was 12, and my father raised me as best he could. He was in shipping, quite successful for many years." She sighed. "Or so everyone thought. After he died, I discovered he'd been living on credit and borrowed money for some time. Bad investments, gambling debts." "That must have been a shock," Grant said. "It was. Everything I thought I knew, our position, our future, it all vanished overnight." Virginia stared into the flames. "The strangest part was the relief I felt underneath the panic. As if a burden I hadn't recognized had been lifted. The burden of pretending to be something you weren't." Virginia looked up, startled by his perception. "Yes, exactly. My father was very concerned with appearances. We lived as he thought we should live, not as we could afford to. And now? What does Virginia Lawson want for herself when there's no one else to please?" It was a profound question, one she'd barely allowed herself to consider. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "Security, certainly, a place of my own," she hesitated, "and perhaps purpose. Something meaningful to build or contribute." Grant nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Good aims, all of them, and achievable with time." They talked long into the evening, sharing childhood memories, favorite books, hopes for the future. When Virginia finally retired to the small tent Grant had pitched for her, she found herself reflecting on how natural their conversation had felt, as if they'd known each other for years rather than days. The journey continued over the next several days, settling into a pleasant routine. They encountered occasional travelers' freight wagons, mail coaches, solitary riders, but for the most part, had the trail to themselves. Virginia's confidence grew as she learned to handle the wagon over various terrains, to help make and break camp, to spot potential water sources from a distance. Grant proved to be an excellent teacher, patient, encouraging, and quick to praise her progress. He was also unfailingly respectful, maintaining proper distance at night and never presuming upon their growing friendship. Yet Virginia couldn't help noticing the way his gaze lingered on her sometimes, or how her own pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched. On the fourth day, the landscape began to change, the rolling plains giving way to more dramatic terrain as they approached the mountains where Helena nestled in a gulch. Grant grew quieter, and Virginia sensed his concern about what they might find when they reached the city. "We should arrive by mid-afternoon tomorrow," he said as they made camp that evening. "There's a hotel where I usually stay, respectable, not too expensive." Virginia nodded, her stomach churning with anxiety. "And then I'll go to the address, see what's left." "I'll come with you," Grant offered. If that's all right, the simple offer of support meant more than she could express. "Yes," she said softly, "I'd like that." That night, sleep eluded her. Virginia lay awake, listening to the night sounds, the soft nickering of the horses, the distant cry of a coyote, the gentle snore from where Grant slept rolled in his blankets near the fire. Tomorrow would bring answers, for better or worse. They reached Helena shortly after noon the following day. Virginia's first impression was of a city in the midst of transformation, new buildings of brick and stone rising alongside weathered wooden structures, streets bustling with activity, the clash of construction competing with the normal sounds of commerce. Grant guided them to a modest hotel on a side street, away from the noisiest parts of town. After securing rooms and stabling the horses, he suggested they seek out his friend at the land office immediately. "Best to know what we're dealing with," he said gently when Virginia hesitated. "No sense prolonging the uncertainty." The land office was a tidy brick building near the center of town. Inside, a balding man with spectacles greeted Grant warmly. "Ryder, didn't expect to see you till the horse auction next week. What brings you to Helena early?" "Special circumstances, Walter," Grant replied, introducing Virginia. "Miss Lawson is inquiring about a property that belonged to her great-uncle. I believe you looked into it for me." Walter's expression sobered. "Ah, yes, the old Lawson place on Pioneer Street." He shuffled through some papers on his desk. "I'm afraid the news isn't good, Miss Lawson. The building was indeed destroyed in the fire last month, nothing salvageable, I'm sorry to say." Virginia felt light-headed, though the news was not unexpected. "And the land itself?" Walter adjusted his spectacles. "Well, that's where things get complicated. Your great-uncle, Elijah Lawson, passed away in '72, correct?" Virginia nodded. "According to our records, property taxes haven't been paid in 4 years. The city placed a lien on the property last year." He looked genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but the land was sold at auction to satisfy the debt just 2 weeks ago." The room seemed to tilt around her. Grant's steady hand at her elbow was all that kept Virginia upright. "There must be some mistake," she said faintly. "My father, he would have received notice." Walter shook his head. "Notices were sent to the address of record right here in Helena. If your father lived elsewhere, he may never have received them." It was the final blow. Not only was the building gone, but the land itself, her last hope, had been sold from under her before she'd even arrived. Virginia felt a curious numbness spreading through her, as if her body were protecting her from feeling the full impact of the disaster. "Thank you for your time," she managed to say, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Outside, the bright Montana sunshine seemed a mockery of her dark circumstances. Grant led her to a small park nearby, finding a bench beneath a cottonwood tree where she could sit and collect herself. "I'm so sorry, Virginia," he said quietly. "I wish the news had been different," she nodded mechanically. "At least now I know." A hollow laugh escaped her. 4 years of unpaid taxes, all this way for nothing. Not nothing, Grant countered. You've made it this far on your own courage. That counts for something? Virginia looked at him, really looked at him, this man who had become, against all odds, her most steadfast ally in a strange land. There was no pity in his eyes, only genuine concern and a steady belief in her that she desperately needed in that moment. What do I do now? She whispered. That depends, he replied. Do you want to stay in Helena, try to find work here? It's possible, though living costs are high, as I mentioned. Virginia considered it briefly. Helena was certainly more familiar territory than a remote ranch, a real city with amenities and society. But it was also a place where she had no connections, no one who cared whether she succeeded or failed. Or, Grant continued when she didn't respond, my offer still stands. Come to the ranch. Give yourself time to heal and plan your next steps. The choice seemed both monumental and surprisingly simple. Your ranch, she said softly, if the offer is still open. Relief crossed his features. It is, always was, he hesitated. I've business here for a few days. The horse auction I mentioned would give you time to purchase any supplies you might need for the journey north. Virginia nodded, suddenly exhausted. That sounds sensible. They returned to the hotel, where Grant insisted on paying for her room despite her weak protests. We'll sort out finances properly once we're at the ranch, he promised. For now, get some rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to make plans. Alone in her room, Virginia finally allowed the tears to come, not just for the lost property, but for the months of uncertainty, fear, and lonely struggle. She cried until no more tears would come, and then lay spent across the bed, emotionally drained. Yet as twilight deepened outside her window, Virginia felt an unexpected calm settling over her. The worst had happened, and she had survived it. There was a curious freedom in having reached the bottom, nowhere to go but up. A knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. It was Grant coming to escort her to dinner. Virginia quickly splashed water on her face and pinned up her hair, grateful that the dim lighting would hide her reddened eyes. The hotel dining room was busy, filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of cutlery on plates. Grant led her to a small table in a corner, ordering for both of them when she confessed to having no appetite. Eat anyway, he advised gently. Hard times are easier to face when you're not hungry on top of everything else. The food was surprisingly good: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. Virginia found herself eating with more enthusiasm than she'd expected, her body asserting its needs despite her emotional turmoil. I was thinking, Grant said as they lingered over coffee, the auction doesn't start until the day after tomorrow. Perhaps you'd like to see something of Helena tomorrow. It might help take your mind off things. Virginia was touched by his consideration. I would like that, she admitted. It seems a shame to have come all this way and see nothing but a land office, Grant smiled. Then it's settled. We'll make a day of it. The next morning dawned clear and pleasant. Virginia dressed in her best remaining outfit, a blue cotton dress that had once been considered merely suitable for morning calls in Boston, but now represented the height of her wardrobe. When Grant knocked on her door, she was struck anew by how handsome he looked in a clean shirt and vest, his hair still damp from washing. You look lovely, he said simply, offering his arm. Helena proved to be a fascinating blend of frontier rawness and emerging sophistication. Grant showed her Last Chance Gulch, where gold had first been discovered, now transformed into a bustling commercial street. They visited a surprisingly well-stocked bookshop, where Virginia indulged in the purchase of a novel she'd been wanting to read. They admired the new territorial capital building under construction and strolled through neighborhoods where substantial homes were rising, evidence of the wealth flowing into the city. It's changing so quickly, Virginia observed as they paused for lunch at a small cafe. Hard to believe this was all wilderness not long ago. Progress marches on, Grant agreed, though sometimes I wonder if we're not too quick to call everything progress. The afternoon brought a visit to a mercantile store where Grant encouraged Virginia to select some practical items for ranch life: sturdy boots, a warm coat for the Montana winter, work gloves, and other necessities. When she protested the expense, he was firm. "Consider it an advance on your wages," he said. "You'll need these things, and better to get them here where there's selection." Virginia reluctantly agreed, secretly relieved to have proper equipment for the challenges ahead. As they were leaving the store, her attention was caught by a display of seed packets in the window. "You have a garden at the ranch?" she asked. Grant looked slightly embarrassed. "Had one years back. It's gone wild now, more weeds than vegetables last few seasons. Never seemed to find time to tend it properly." Virginia found herself suddenly enthusiastic about the possibility of restoring it. "Perhaps that could be one of my first projects," she suggested. "If you wouldn't mind, I'd be grateful." His smile was warm. Nothing better than fresh vegetables after years of beans and salt pork. They returned to the seed display, where Virginia carefully selected varieties suited to Montana's short growing season: peas, beans, carrots, potatoes, hardy greens. She added a few packets of flower seeds as well, earning a raised eyebrow from Grant. "Beauty has its place, even on a working ranch," she defended her choice. "No argument from me," he replied, his gaze lingering on her face in a way that brought warmth to her cheeks. That evening, they dined at Helena's finest restaurant, Grant's treat, he insisted, to mark the beginning of their partnership. The elegant surroundings and attentive service reminded Virginia poignantly of her former life, yet she found herself viewing it with new eyes. The other diners, dressed in their finery and displaying their wealth, seemed somehow less substantial than the people she'd met in Pinewood Creek, as if they were playing at life rather than living it fully. "Penny for your thoughts," Grant said, noticing her contemplative expression. Virginia smiled. "I was just thinking how different everything looks to me now compared to when I left Boston, how my idea of what matters has changed. For better or worse, definitely for better," she said without hesitation. "I've lost so much, yet somehow I feel freer." Grant nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's the gift of the West, I think. Strips away pretense, forces you to see what's real." Their conversation flowed easily, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd seen, childhood memories. Grant spoke of his hopes for the ranch expanding the herd, improving the breeding stock, perhaps adding sheep eventually. Virginia found herself caught up in his vision, offering suggestions and asking questions that revealed her genuine interest. As they walked back to the hotel through streets illuminated by gas lamps, Virginia was acutely aware of Grant's presence beside her, the solid strength of him, the faint scent of soap and leather, the way his hand occasionally brushed hers. It would be so easy to slip her hand into his, to acknowledge the growing connection between them. Yet something held her back, not propriety, but a sense that what was building between them deserved time and space to develop naturally. The next 2 days passed in a blend of activity and anticipation. Grant attended the horse auction, successfully purchasing 2 quality mares for breeding. Virginia explored more of Helena, even attending a musical performance at the newly built opera house. In the evenings, they compared notes on their days and finalized plans for the journey to Grant's ranch. On the morning of their departure, Virginia found herself eager to be on the road again. Helena, for all its amenities, held no real place for her. Her future lay elsewhere now. Grant had traded her wagon for a more substantial one, better suited for the rougher trails to his ranch. Their supplies were carefully packed, the new horses integrated with their small caravan, and by mid-morning they were heading north out of the city. "It's about 3 days' travel to the ranch," Grant explained as the buildings of Helena receded behind them. "Terrain gets more challenging, but nothing the wagon can't handle if we're careful." Virginia nodded, taking the reins with a confidence she would never have possessed just weeks ago. "I'm ready." The trail led through increasingly rugged country pine-covered hills, swift-flowing creeks, meadows bursting with late summer wildflowers. Grant pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his early days in the territory. Virginia found herself trying to memorize every detail, as if assembling a map of this new world she was entering. They made camp the first night in a sheltered valley beside a clear stream. As they sat by the fire after their evening meal, Grant seemed unusually thoughtful, almost hesitant. "There's something I should probably tell you," he said finally, "before we get to the ranch." Virginia tensed slightly. "What is it?" "It's nothing bad," he assured her quickly. Well, I haven't been entirely forthcoming about my living situation." He sighed. "I don't live completely alone. There's a boy, Jamie. 12 years old, son of my foreman who died last winter." Virginia blinked, surprised but not alarmed. "You've taken him in," Grant nodded. "His mother died years ago, no other family to speak of. He's a good kid, works hard, smart as a whip. Been helping me run things while I'm gone." He looked at her directly. "I should have mentioned him sooner, just wasn't sure how you'd feel about it." "About a child," Virginia smiled. "I like children, Grant, and I admire you for taking responsibility for him." Relief crossed his features. "He can be a bit wary of strangers, especially women. Had some notion his father might remarry before he died, wasn't too keen on the idea." "I understand," Virginia said gently. "He's lost a great deal. I won't push where I'm not wanted." Grant reached across the space between them, briefly touching her hand. "Thank you for understanding, and for not being angry I didn't mention him sooner." The touch sent warmth coursing up Virginia's arm. "We've all got parts of our stories we share when we're ready," she said. "I'm sure there's plenty about me you don't know yet either." "Looking forward to finding out," he replied, his voice low and warm in the firelight. The remaining journey passed peacefully, each day bringing them closer to what Virginia was beginning to think of as her new home, at least temporarily. The landscape grew more dramatic, rugged hills giving way to grassy valleys, stands of pine and aspen providing welcome shade, distant mountains forming a spectacular backdrop to their travels. On the afternoon of the third day, Grant's demeanor changed, a new energy in his movements as he rode ahead, then back to the wagon. "Just over this next rise," he said, excitement evident in his voice. "You can see the whole valley from there." Virginia felt her heart quicken as they crested the hill. Below them stretched a verdant valley, bisected by a winding creek lined with cottonwoods. Nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills sat a sturdy log house with a broad porch, several outbuildings clustered nearby. Meadows stretched in both directions, dotted with grazing cattle. Smoke curled from the house's chimney, a welcome sign of habitation. "It's beautiful," Virginia breathed, genuinely moved by the peaceful scene. "Home," Grant said simply, but there was pride in his voice. "Nothing fancy, but it's good land." As they descended into the valley, a figure emerged from the house, a lanky boy with a mop of dark hair, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. When he recognized Grant, he broke into a run, meeting them halfway down the track. "Thought you weren't due back till next week," the boy said, his attempt at casualness belied by his evident relief. "Finished early," Grant replied, swinging down from his horse to ruffle the boy's hair affectionately. "Everything all right here?" "Fine. Had some coyotes after the chickens, but I fixed that fence like you showed me." His curious gaze shifted to Virginia, wariness replacing excitement. "Jamie, this is Miss Virginia Lawson," Grant said. "She'll be staying with us for a while, helping with the house and garden." "Virginia, this is Jamie Mitchell," Virginia offered her warmest smile. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Jamie. Mr. Ryder has told me what a help you've been to him." The boy shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what needs doing," he muttered, then turned back to Grant. "Got stew on. Figured you'd be hungry after the trail." "Starving," Grant confirmed. "Let's get these horses taken care of and then we'll eat." Jamie darted ahead to open the gate while Grant guided the wagon down the last stretch of road. As they approached the house, Virginia took in the details: the solid construction, the neat fencing, the carefully maintained barn and corral. There was pride in this place, in every post and rail. The house itself was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a substantial log structure with a stone chimney and several windows. The broad porch held 2 rocking chairs and a bench, simple comforts for enjoying the spectacular view. Inside was surprisingly spacious, a large main room with a cooking area at one end, a massive stone fireplace at the other, and simple but solid furniture throughout. Doors led to what Virginia presumed were bedrooms, and a steep staircase suggested additional space above. "Jamie's room is through there," Grant explained, gesturing to a door off the main room. "Mine's upstairs. There's another room up there that would be yours. It's small, but it catches the morning sun." Virginia followed him up the stairs, noting the craftsmanship evident in the hand-hewn banisters and polished wood floors. The upper floor held 2 rooms, Grant's larger bedroom at one end and a smaller but charming room at the other. The smaller room had a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with a wash basin, and a window that indeed faced east, currently framing a spectacular view of the valley. "It's lovely," Virginia said sincerely. "Far more comfortable than I expected." Grant looked pleased. "Built most of it myself with help from Jamie's father. Took 3 years to get it just right." He hesitated in the doorway. "I'll let you get settled. Supper in an hour." Left alone, Virginia sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's journey and the reality of her new situation. She was here, hundreds of miles from everything familiar, about to begin a life she could never have imagined just months ago. Yet, as she unpacked her few belongings and washed away the dust of the trail, Virginia felt a growing sense of possibility rather than dread. This place, with its solid walls and spectacular views, its garden waiting to be reclaimed and its small family of 2 needing a woman's touch, offered something she'd never fully had in Boston. Purpose. Supper was a simple but hearty affair: venison stew, biscuits, and coffee. Jamie was mostly silent, watching Virginia with undisguised suspicion when he thought she wasn't looking. Grant kept the conversation light, sharing news from Helena and describing the horses he'd purchased at the auction. After the meal, Virginia insisted on washing the dishes despite Grant's protests. "If I'm to earn my keep, I should start now," she said firmly. Jamie hovered nearby, clearly torn between curiosity about this interloper and loyalty to his established routine with Grant. Finally, he blurted out, "Why'd you come here? Ain't much for a city lady." "Jamie," Grant warned, but Virginia shook her head. "It's a fair question," she said, turning to the boy. "I came because I had nowhere else to go, to be honest. My plans in Helena didn't work out. Mr. Ryder kindly offered me a place to stay while I decide what to do next." The simple truth seemed to resonate with the boy better than any elaborate explanation would have. He nodded slowly. "You know how to garden. That patch out back needs work." "I know some," Virginia admitted. "And what I don't know, I can learn. Perhaps you could help me. Show me what grows well here." Jamie considered this, clearly pleased to be consulted as an authority. "Could do," he allowed. "Got some squash seeds saved from last year. They did all right." And just like that, a tentative connection was formed, built on honest need and the boy's natural desire to be useful. Virginia caught Grant's eye across the room and saw approval and something warmer in his gaze. That night, lying in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind in the pines, the occasional call of a night bird, Virginia felt a peace she hadn't known in years. There were challenges ahead, certainly. This arrangement was temporary, its future uncertain. But for now, for this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. The days quickly fell into a rhythm. Virginia rose early, preparing breakfast for the 3 of them before Grant and Jamie headed out for their morning chores. She spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house, which had clearly suffered from the absence of a woman's touch. Afternoons were devoted to the garden, where Jamie proved to be a knowledgeable if reluctant assistant, showing her which plants thrived in the Montana soil and which succumbed to early frosts. Grant gave her space to find her footing, neither hovering nor abandoning her to figure everything out alone. He was gone much of the day, tending to the cattle, mending fences, breaking the new horses to harness. But evenings brought them together around the table, sharing the day's events and slowly building the foundations of something that felt increasingly like a family. Jamie's initial wariness gradually gave way to cautious acceptance. He began seeking Virginia out to show her things: a bird's nest he'd discovered, a particularly fine trout he'd caught, a clever repair he'd made to one of the chicken coops. Virginia met each overture with genuine interest, careful never to patronize or overpraise. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Virginia was sitting on the porch darning socks, a practical skill she'd recently acquired under Mrs. Weaver's tutelage, when Jamie appeared, clutching something behind his back. "Made something for your room," he mumbled, thrusting a small wooden shelf toward her. "For your books and such." Virginia took it carefully, admiring the simple but sturdy construction. "Jamie, this is wonderful. Did you make it yourself?" He nodded, pleased but embarrassed by her reaction. "Grant helped some with the sanding, but I did the cutting and nailing." "It's exactly what I need," she said truthfully. "Would you help me hang it later?" His chest puffed with pride. "Course, got the nails and everything ready." As he dashed off to tend to evening chores, Grant emerged from the barn, crossing the yard with that long, easy stride that Virginia had come to anticipate watching each evening. He climbed the porch steps, settling into the rocker beside her. "Saw Jamie's gift," he commented, nodding toward the shelf in her lap. "Been working on it in secret for days." "It's lovely," Virginia said, "and so thoughtful. He's warming to you, faster than I expected, honestly." Virginia smiled, returning to her darning. "Children sense when you're genuine with them. I haven't tried to replace anyone in his life just to find my own place." Grant watched her hands move deftly with the needle and thread. "You found more than that," he said quietly. "You've changed this place in just 2 weeks, Virginia. Made it feel like a home again." She glanced up, caught by the intensity in his green eyes. "It's a wonderful place, Grant. I'm just helping it shine a bit more." "Not just the place," he said, his voice low. "Us too. Jamie's happier than I've seen him since his father died, and I." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I've remembered what it's like to look forward to coming back to the house at day's end." The simple admission touched Virginia deeply. "I've been happy here too," she confessed. "Happier than I expected to be." They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Virginia was acutely aware of Grant's presence beside her, the rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and pine that always seemed to accompany him, the warmth that radiated from him even without physical contact. "Virginia," he said finally, his voice gentle. "I know we agreed this was temporary, that you needed time to decide your next steps, but I find myself hoping." He trailed off, then tried again. "That is, I wonder if you've given any thought to staying, not just for now, but for good." Her heart quickened. "Are you asking me to continue as your housekeeper?" Grant shook his head, turning to face her fully. "I'm asking if you might consider a more permanent arrangement between us." Virginia's breath caught. "You mean marriage?" "Yes." His gaze held her steadily. "I know it's soon. Too soon, perhaps, but I also know what I feel when I'm with you, what I see developing between us. I'm not a man given to uncertainty, Virginia. When I know what I want, I don't see the sense in waiting to pursue it." The directness of his proposal was so typically Grant, straightforward, honest, without artifice. Yet Virginia found herself hesitating, not from lack of feeling but from its abundance. "Grant, I care for you deeply," she said carefully, "more than I thought possible in such a short time. But marriage it's not something to enter into lightly." "No, it's not," he agreed, "and I wouldn't ask if I wasn't certain, but I understand if you need more time." Virginia reached across the space between them, taking his hand in hers. "I do need time," she admitted. "Not because I doubt my feelings for you, but because I want to be sure I'm choosing this life, choosing you for the right reasons, not just out of gratitude or necessity." Grant turned her hand over, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Fair enough," he said softly. "I can be patient, Virginia. For you, I can wait." The touch of his hand sent waves of warmth through her, and Virginia found herself imagining a future here: winters by the fire, springs in the garden, summers watching the valley bloom, autumns harvesting the fruits of their labor. A life built on mutual respect and growing love, with a boy who needed her and a man who wanted her for herself, not for what she represented. "I'm not saying no," she clarified, needing him to understand. "I'm just asking for a little more time to be sure." Grant's smile was warm with understanding, Time you shall have," he promised. "Though I reserve the right to continue showing you why life here could be good for both of us." True to his word, Grant didn't press the issue in the days that followed, but Virginia noticed subtle changes in their interactions. His hand lingered when helping her down from the wagon, his eyes sought hers more frequently across the table, and he found more reasons to be near the house during the day, bringing her wildflowers he'd found while checking fence lines, stopping by the garden to admire her progress, joining her for midday meals when previously he'd eaten on the range. October brought the first frosts, painting the aspen trees gold and the sumac crimson. Virginia threw herself into preserving the garden's bounty, canning vegetables, drying herbs, storing potatoes and squash in the cool root cellar beneath the house. Jamie proved an enthusiastic helper in these tasks, especially when they resulted in immediate rewards like fresh apple pie or blackberry jam. Grant and a neighboring rancher spent several days rounding up cattle from the higher pastures, moving them to sheltered valleys where they would weather the coming winter. Virginia found herself watching for his return each evening with increasing anticipation, missing his presence when he was gone for more than a day. One crisp afternoon, as Virginia was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Grant was returning earlier than expected, accompanied by a stranger, a woman, to Virginia's surprise, riding side saddle on a sleek bay mare. Virginia smoothed her apron and went to greet them, curious about this unexpected visitor. The woman was perhaps 40, handsome rather than pretty, dressed in a well-tailored riding habit that spoke of money and taste. "Virginia," Grant called as they dismounted. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, our closest neighbor to the east. Eleanor, Miss Virginia Lawson." "A pleasure, Mrs." Thornton said, assessing Virginia with shrewd blue eyes. "I've been away in St. Louis visiting family. Just returned to find Grant has acquired a housekeeper in my absence." There was something pointed in her use of the word housekeeper that made Virginia straighten her spine. "I assist with the house and garden," she confirmed evenly. "Mr. Ryder has been kind enough to provide me with accommodation while I establish myself in the territory." "How fortunate for you both," Mrs. Thornton replied, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. She turned to Grant. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some refreshment before I continue home. It's been a long ride." "Of course," Grant said, though Virginia detected a certain stiffness in his manner. "Virginia makes an excellent coffee." Inside, as Virginia prepared coffee and set out the last of the morning's biscuits with fresh preserves, she was acutely aware of Mrs. Thornton's calculating gaze following her movements. The woman removed her gloves and hat, making herself comfortable at the table with the air of someone who had sat there many times before. "Your ranch is looking well, Grant," she remarked. "Better than when I left in August. I see Miss Lawson's influence extends beyond the house." "Virginia's been a blessing," Grant agreed, his eyes meeting Virginia's warmly across the room. "The place has never looked better." Mrs. Thornton's lips thinned slightly. "Yes, well, a woman's touch is always valuable in a bachelor establishment, though one must be careful not to become dependent on temporary arrangements." The implication was clear, and Virginia felt a flush rising to her cheeks. Before she could respond, Jamie burst through the door, stopping short when he saw their visitor. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, his usual exuberance dampened. "You're back." "Indeed I am, James," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And apparently much has changed in my absence." Jamie's gaze darted between the adults, sensing tension. "Virginia's teaching me to read," he announced suddenly. "She knows all kinds of books, even Shakespeare." "How educational," Mrs. Thornton murmured, "though I wonder if a boy destined for ranching needs such literary pursuits." "Every mind benefits from books," Virginia said, unable to keep silent any longer. "And Jamie has a quick intelligence that deserves nurturing, Mrs. Thornton raised an eyebrow. "You seem to have formed strong opinions about the boy's upbringing in a short time, Miss Lawson." "Virginia has a gift for understanding what people need," Grant interjected, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. "Jamie, why don't you see to Mrs. Thornton's horse?" Make sure she has water before the ride home." The boy seemed relieved to escape the charged atmosphere, darting back outside. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only when Virginia placed coffee cups on the table. "I understand you were in Helena recently, Mrs. Thornton said to Grant, stirring sugar into her cup. "Did you find suitable horses at the auction?" The conversation turned to safer topics: livestock prices, the early frost, news from Helena, but Virginia remained tense, aware that she was being evaluated and found wanting by this sophisticated woman who clearly had some prior claim on Grant's attention. When Mrs. Thornton finally departed an hour later, Virginia busied herself clearing away the coffee things, her mind churning with questions and unexpected jealousy. Grant returned from seeing their visitor off, his expression troubled. "I should have warned you about Helena," he said without preamble. Virginia kept her tone neutral. "She seems formidable," Grant sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Her husband was a friend, good man, died in a fall from a horse 3 years ago, left her the neighboring ranch, 4,000 acres, one of the largest spreads in the county. She runs it efficiently, I'll give her that, and you and she are." Virginia let the question hang. "Neighbors," Grant said firmly. "Nothing more, despite her occasional hints. I admired her husband, and I've tried to be a good neighbor since his passing. But there's never been anything between us." Relief washed through Virginia, followed immediately by shame at her reaction. "It's none of my business," she said quickly. "Your past or present associations, it is your business," Grant interrupted, moving closer. "Because I want a future with you, Virginia, only you." The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, made her heart race. Grant stood before her now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, the slight curve of his mouth as he gazed down at her. "Helena Thornton represents a certain kind of security," he continued. "A business arrangement that would benefit both ranches, but that's not what I want, not what I need." "What do you need?" Virginia whispered. Grant's hand came up to gently cup her cheek. "You," he said simply, "your courage, your kindness, your stubborn pride. The way you see beauty in simple things. How you've made this place a home without changing its essential character. How you've given Jamie something I never could: understanding and patience." Virginia leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of it. "I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you," she admitted. "It frightens me sometimes how quickly it's happened. Does it help to know I feel the same?" His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone. "That I wake every morning grateful you're here and go to sleep each night praying you'll stay?" Virginia opened her eyes, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes," she breathed. "It helps very much." Grant's other hand came to rest at her waist, drawing her gently closer. "May I kiss you, Virginia?" In answer, she lifted her face to his. The first touch of his lips was gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Virginia had no desire to retreat. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart as the kiss deepened, becoming a declaration of all they'd left unspoken. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Grant rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since Pinewood Creek," he confessed. Virginia smiled, a new confidence flowing through her. "I've been wanting you to," she admitted. The sound of the door opening had them stepping apart, though Grant kept hold of her hand. Jamie entered, his expression wary. "Is she gone?" he asked. "Yes, she's gone," Grant confirmed. "And she won't be dictating how you spend your time or what you learn, regardless of what she thinks is suitable." Jamie's face cleared. "Good, she always makes me feel like I'm doing everything wrong." He glanced between them, noting their clasped hands with a raised eyebrow that made him look suddenly older. "So, are you two?" Grant looked to Virginia, letting her take the lead. She smiled, squeezing Grant's hand. "We're figuring things out," she said honestly. "But yes, I care very much for Grant, and for you," she added. Jamie considered this. "Does that mean you're staying, not just for a while, but for good?" It was the question Virginia had been asking herself for weeks. Looking at Grant's hopeful expression and Jamie's barely concealed anxiety, she found the answer came easily. "Yes," she said softly. If you both want me to, I'd like to stay for good." The joy that blazed across Grant's face was matched by Jamie's whoop of excitement. The boy launched himself at Virginia, wrapping his arms around her waist in his first spontaneous display of affection. "Does this mean we're going to be a real family?" he asked, his voice muffled against her apron. Virginia stroked his dark hair, her eyes meeting Grant's over the boy's head. "I think we already are," she said. "We just needed to recognize it." Later that evening, after Jamie had gone to bed, Virginia and Grant sat on the porch watching stars appear in the velvet sky. Her hand rested in his, their fingers intertwined as naturally as if they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. "I meant what I said earlier," Virginia said quietly. "I want to stay, to build a life here with you and Jamie." Grant brought her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. "I was hoping you'd say that, but I want to do this right." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small leather pouch. "This belonged to my grandmother. My father gave it to me before I left Ohio, said to save it for when I found the right woman." He emptied the pouch into his palm, revealing a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. In the lamplight from the window, it gleamed with quiet elegance. "Virginia Lawson," Grant said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need a home or I need a housekeeper, but because I love you and want to build a life together." Tears sprang to Virginia's eyes at the simple, heartfelt proposal. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Grant Ryder, because I love you too." He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. Then he gathered her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all the years ahead of challenges faced together, joys shared, and a love that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a dusty Montana road. Winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in snow before November's end. Virginia and Grant were married in Pinewood Creek 2 weeks before Christmas, in a simple ceremony attended by the Weavers, the Baileys, and a few neighboring ranchers. Jamie stood proudly as Grant's best man, his growth spurt requiring new trousers for the occasion. Mrs. Thornton sent a silver tea service as a wedding gift, but declined to attend, citing poor road conditions. Virginia accepted the gift graciously, recognizing the olive branch for what it was, an acknowledgement, if not quite an approval. Their wedding night was a revelation, tender, passionate, and marked by a depth of connection that transcended the physical. Grant was a considerate lover, and Virginia discovered aspects of herself she'd never known existed in the safety of his embrace. Christmas brought a heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for several days. They celebrated in their own way with a small tree cut from their land and decorated with pine cones, ribbons, and candles, with gifts made by hand during the long evening hours, with a feast prepared from the summer's preserved bounty. Jamie's gift to Virginia was a wooden box he'd crafted for her sewing supplies, each compartment carefully measured and fitted. Grant gave her a leather-bound journal and a silver pen. "For your thoughts," he explained. "You have a way with words that shouldn't be wasted." Virginia's gift to Grant was a hand-knitted scarf in soft blue wool, her first completed knitting project, taught by Mrs. Weaver during their stay in Pinewood Creek. For Jamie, she had made a quilt from scraps of fabric collected over months, each square representing something from their shared life: blue for the sky over the ranch, green for the summer grass, red for the apples they'd harvested together, brown for the horses he loved. In the new year, letters arrived from Boston, responses to inquiries Virginia had sent months before. One contained surprising news: a small inheritance from a maternal aunt who had passed away, unknown to Virginia until now. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to purchase additional cattle for the ranch and to set aside a fund for Jamie's education. "See," Grant said as they discussed the unexpected windfall, "the world has a way of balancing things. You lost one inheritance but gained another." "I gained far more than money," Virginia replied, leaning into his embrace. "I found where I belong. Spring came late but gloriously, transforming the valley almost overnight from white to green. The garden expanded under Virginia's care, now including a small orchard of apple and cherry trees that would bear fruit in years to come. Jamie grew 3 inches that summer, his voice beginning to change, his interests expanding beyond the ranch to include books about distant places and scientific discoveries. When autumn painted the valley gold once more, Virginia discovered she was expecting their first child. Grant's joy was boundless, his care for her during the pregnancy both touching and occasionally amusing in its intensity. Jamie received the news with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, but Virginia's assurance that his place in their family was secure gradually eased his concerns. Their daughter, Elizabeth Grace Ryder, was born on a clear May morning in 1878, with Mrs. Weaver attending as midwife. She had Grant's green eyes and a dusting of Virginia's auburn hair, and from her first day showed signs of a determination that both parents recognized in themselves. "She's perfect," Grant whispered, holding his daughter with a tenderness that brought tears to Virginia's eyes. "Just like her mother." As Elizabeth grew, so did the ranch, expanding to include sheep as Grant had once envisioned, a larger vegetable garden that supplied produce to neighbors and the general store in Pinewood Creek, and additional grazing land purchased from a neighboring ranch whose owner was returning east. Jamie left for school in Helena when he turned 16, his natural intelligence earning him a scholarship to a respected academy. His letters home were full of discoveries and new ideas, but always ended with plans for his return to the ranch that remained his anchor. Virginia found her own unexpected calling as well. Her letters to friends in Boston, describing life in Montana Territory, caught the attention of a publisher seeking authentic accounts of Western life. Her first book, a collection of essays about adapting to frontier living, was published in 1881 and met with surprising success. Others followed, earning her a modest reputation as a voice of the changing West. Through it all, her relationship with Grant deepened and strengthened. There were disagreements, of course, times when his stubborn practicality clashed with her idealism, or when the demands of ranch life tested both their patience. But there was also laughter, passion, quiet evenings by the fire, and the profound satisfaction of building something lasting together. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching Elizabeth chase fireflies in the twilight, Grant took Virginia's hand in his. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming west, all you left behind?" Virginia considered the question, her gaze taking in the valley that had become more home than anywhere she'd ever lived. "Not for a moment," she said truthfully. "Everything I thought I lost led me here, to you, to Jamie, to Elizabeth, to this life we've made." Grant's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her close. "I saw you that day on the trail, too proud to ask for help even though you were in trouble. Something about that stubborn dignity caught me. Knew right then you were someone special." Virginia smiled, remembering how desperately she'd tried to hide her circumstances, how ashamed she'd been of her need. "I'm glad you saw through me," she said softly. "Glad you offered your hand when I couldn't bring myself to ask." "Best decision I ever made," Grant murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. As darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Virginia leaned into her husband's embrace, profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought her here to this man, this land, this life that had begun with a broken wagon wheel and a cowboy's outstretched hand.